Hi guys. For the longest time I struggled to get great recorded bass tone. With a lot of help and perseverance, I finally got the defined punchy bass tone I've been looking for, and I thought I'd share some of the method with you. Let me go ahead and show you the track we're using as an example here so you can get a picture of what the bass sounds like. Cool, so that's everything in the mix, except I took the lead guitars out. So let me go ahead and break down the bass and show it to you by itself. Okay, so what I have there, my friend Holden Denboer did a great job playing the bass. So it first starts with the person doing a great job of pulling the tone out of the instrument. He was playing just a pretty stock standard Fender jazz bass into a Mark bass head. We took the DI out of the bass head and ran that into the computer, and then I did a bunch of plug-in work with that. The first thing to realize is that if you hear master recordings of the bass track isolated, a lot of times it sounds really god-awful. And the reason for that is you know the bass usually is a lot dirtier than you think it is, because you have to add a lot of grit and compression to it to get the definition that you need. And you don't notice the grit when the whole track is going, but it's necessary because bass is a really flat sound. The other part of that is that usually what sounds good on its own, you know, normally where we like the mid-range for guitar and vocals and that, has to be carved out for the guitars and the vocals. So with the bass, you have to boost a lot of certain weird mid-frequencies and really high mid-frequencies and add distortion and compression to get the articulation of the attack and everything. So let me let you hear it with all the plugins off. Okay, so notice that that's coming right out of the Mark bass amp. We're running the gain pretty high in the Mark bass amp to get it to compress and crunch up. We're trying to add harmonics and compression and grit and articulation to the tone that you just wouldn't have if we had gone straight in DI into the computer through kind of a flat DI, which is what I was trying in the past that wasn't working. So it's a pretty good tone, but what we have to do now is we have to add some compression. So let me let you hear it with the compressor on. Okay, so what we have is actually a pretty conservative compression ratio. It's around like 3-to-1, and the limiter is on. So what's going on is the limiter is hitting the peaks as well as the compressor working, and that's actually adding distortion and crunch to it. So we're actually overloading the compressor a little bit, so the idea is to add layers of compression and distortion every pass as we're adding different plugins. The other part to keep in mind is I'm real careful about tweaking the output gain of the plugin so that when I run into the EQ or the next one, I'm making sure we're not over exceeding the amount of decibels that are going to get into the next plugin and then maybe accidentally introducing digital clipping. Anyway, there's lots of different compressor plugins. I just goofed around until I found one that I felt gave me the coloration I wanted for the clarity. Anyway, sounds really cool. Okay, the next part is I'm adding EQ to it. So the bass is a little tricky because the tone sounds cool, but what I need to do is I need to increase some really upper, like low treble, high mid-range stuff, and scoop and boost a little bit of the other mid-range in the bass to kind of sculpt it to leave space for all the other instruments. Here's what it sounds like. In Logic, I'm using the console EQ, which is a emulation of a Neve channel strip. So what's cool about it is, rather than just EQing, when I'm pushing certain frequencies, it's emulating the analog components, overdriving and coloring a little bit. You have less ability to dial in certain settings, but they just work, and they sound really musical in this. If you were looking to have it be more of just a neutral sounding EQ, you might want to go with a different EQ, but this sounds really great on things that you want to add color to. Let me let you hear what that does to it. Cool, so you notice it's getting crunchier, and I didn't actually cut a mid-range frequency, but I boosted around, let's see, we boosted around 2000 by about 10 decibels, and the high frequency, which is just a preset frequency setting on the mimicking what the Neve does, that's boosting about 9.5 decibels, and we're boosting at about 85 hertz. Now, I wouldn't have thought I would normally do that, but sometimes you do what you have to do. We had dialed in like a tight, punchy setting on the jazz bass using mainly the bridge pickup, so we needed to bring in a little bit of the low stuff there to sculpt around the guitar stuff. And we're driving it a little bit by a few decibels. So that's what we're doing, is adding, instead of adding the distortion all in one place or using a distortion plug-in along with it, we're adding a little bit of compression and distortion and coloration with each pass. So we're not doing it all at once. That layering tends to work better on the bass. Okay, the last step. I'm adding a limiter. Now I've got it on the legacy mode. What that's doing is, rather than being kind of a transparent limiter, it's mimicking the way an analog compressor, a limiter, if you pushed it hard, it would add distortion and coloration to it. So we're doing a little bit of that just to glue it together after you've boosted some of the EQ. This is just to hit some of the peakiness of the levels and add yet a little bit more compression and distortion and coloration to it. We are using the soft knee on the limiter here, but just a little bit. So here's what it sounds like. Okay, now back with the whole thing in the mix. Cool. So, what was I doing wrong before? Well, I was erroneously thinking that I could take a bass guitar and run it right into my really transparent radial DI, and then add a bunch of compression, EQ, and maybe distortion, bass amp plugins and stuff like that to kind of get the vibe that a real bass amp would do. I never had great success with that. And the problem too was, my thinking was that bass tones were cleaner than they are. And the realization that even the cleanest bass tones have a lot of grit to them in order to add the clarity. That was from actually watching a lot of Rick Beato videos where he showed the master recordings of things like Red Hot Chili Peppers recordings. And you'd think that Flea's bass tone was pretty clean and punchy, and then you'd realize, it almost sounded like they darn near had like a fuzz pedal on. So that got me thinking, okay, I really need to get an actual punchy analog circuit for the bass to hit first and drive that hard and send that into the computer. And that happened to be the trick with that. You don't necessarily need a bass head, because remember, you're just taking the preamp sound. There's plenty of companies like Dark Glass and Aguilar that make great preamps that you can add some grit and compression first there, and I think that's the way to go. I'm sure there's some plugins that are getting better at this, but I'm a firm believer in, let's do the analog pass first, and it's something that's intended for bass. It does a great job at preserving the frequencies, which is kind of difficult when you have a lot of sub-frequencies. It can, if it's very digital sounding, it can mess with that sound. So that's the key to that. The other thing you could do, so like I'm adding little bits of distortion, let's say at each pass, at the compressor, the EQ, and the limiter. You could also, if it were a different sort of thing, take that sound and duplicate it, and then run it completely wet through an overdrive section, and then blend those two together. That might be something I do if it was a harder rock thing. I'm pleased with the way this sounded because I'm going sort of for like a Geddy Lee meets funk thing, and I think that was effective at doing what we needed to do there. The other part is, be conscious of trying different sort of EQ things out. Depending on if it's a different bass player or a different bass, I might try a totally different compressor type and different EQ. But to me, the key is adding color and compression and little bits of distortion, so you're building up the harmonic layering, because a bass doesn't have that. It's very clean DI sounding inherently compared to what a guitar sounds. Anyway, those are my thoughts on it. I hope this helps you guys out. Have a good one.